Adrian walked into my house that Tuesday morning without knocking, like the door and everything behind it already belonged to him. I was standing in the kitchen, slowly stirring my tea, when he stepped inside with a kind of certainty that immediately felt wrong. His face was set, his tone already decided before he even spoke. "Mom," he said, "we're moving in, me, Laura, the kids, and her mother too. The apartment isn't working anymore, so this just makes sense." His words filled the room before I could even respond, leaving no space for a question, no room for my opinion, just a conclusion delivered like it had already been approved. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just stood there, listening to the quiet clink of the spoon against the cup in my hand, trying to process what I had just heard. This house, every wall, every corner, every piece of it had been built through years of effort, sacrifice, and patience. Decades of working, saving, and going without, so that one day I could finally have something that was mine. And now my own son stood in front of me, calmly deciding how it would be used, as if my role in all of it had somehow disappeared. But I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice or tell him to leave. Instead, I gave a small nod, the kind that made me look tired, maybe even agreeable. But inside, everything was the opposite. My thoughts were sharp, focused, moving faster than they had in years. Adrian believed he had just taken control of the situation, but what he didn't realize was that I had already started thinking ahead. I had spent most of my life being patient, accommodating, and putting others first. But something about that moment made one thing very clear: if I stayed silent now, I wouldn't just lose space in my home, I would lose my independence. My name is Alina Whitmore. I am 70 years old, and I spent most of my life working as a housekeeper in a small coastal inn. It wasn't glamorous work. It was long hours, sore muscles, and hands that never quite recovered from the years of scrubbing and lifting. But it was honest work, it paid the bills, it helped me raise my children, and slowly over time it allowed me to pay off this house piece by piece, payment by payment. After my husband passed 10 years ago, this house became more than just a place to live. It became my peace. Living alone wasn't something I feared. In fact, it became something I valued deeply. My mornings were quiet, predictable. My routines were simple. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to adjust myself to fit anyone else's expectations. But to my children, that independence looked different. To them, it looked like vulnerability. As if living alone meant I needed supervision, or worse, that I was waiting for someone to step in and take control. What they never understood was that I wasn't lonely. I was finally free. As Adrian continued talking about how the arrangement would only be temporary, I recognized the pattern immediately. I had heard that word before, temporary. It always sounded harmless, reassuring even. But in reality, it rarely stayed that way. Temporary had a quiet way of becoming permanent, especially when it was built on assumption instead of agreement. I knew how these conversations usually went. First, concern, then suggestion. Then expectation, and finally pressure. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house around me, the clock ticking, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the quiet creak of old wood settling. Normally, those sounds brought comfort, but that night they felt different. They felt like something I might lose, and that's when the thought came to me clearly: if I didn't make a decision for myself, someone else would make it for me. And once that happened, there would be no undoing it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen. The house was still, wrapped in that quiet I had come to love. I made my tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the sky slowly began to lighten. Adrian's words replayed in my mind again and again. "We're moving in, not can we, not what do you think." Just a decision already made, and in that moment something settled inside me. If I allowed this to happen, it wouldn't just be a small inconvenience. It would be the end of the life I had built for myself, my privacy, my routines. My sense of ownership over my own space. It wouldn't disappear all at once. It would fade slowly, piece by piece, until one day I would realize there was nothing left that truly belonged to me. I wasn't afraid of helping my family. I had done that my entire life, but there's a difference between helping and being taken for granted. And what Adrian was doing didn't feel like a request. It felt like a decision made without me. I reached for my phone and called Lucia. She answered on the second ring, her voice steady as always. "You're up early," she said. "I need you to come over," I replied. "It's time." There was a brief pause, not confused, not surprised. Lucia had always understood tone better than most people understood words. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, and she was. She arrived exactly when she said she would, carrying a small bag of fresh bread and that quiet sense of calm she always brought with her. We sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time since Adrian's announcement, I allowed myself to speak openly. I told her everything: how he walked in without asking, how he spoke like it was already decided, how a part of me almost agreed out of habit just to avoid conflict. Lucia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't rush to give advice. Instead, she asked one simple question. "What do you want, Alina?" Not what Adrian wanted, not what was easiest, not what would keep the peace. What I wanted, and for the first time I answered honestly. "I want my life to stay the way it is," I said quietly. "I want my home to stay mine. I don't want to feel like a guest in my own space." Lucia nodded as if she had been waiting for that answer. "Then that's all that matters," she said. I hesitated for a moment, then leaned slightly closer. "I've already made a plan," I admitted. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in curiosity. And for the next hour, I told her everything. 2 days later, right on schedule, Laura arrived. She knocked this time, but lightly, almost casually, like she already expected the door to open for her. When I welcomed her inside, she greeted me with a bright smile and a box of pastries, her tone warm and cheerful. "I thought we could have coffee together," she said, stepping in before I could fully respond. I watched her carefully as she moved through the kitchen, placing the box on the table and immediately beginning to talk. "We're almost ready," she said excitedly. "The kids are so happy. Oliver is already talking about his new room, and Mia has plans for a little sewing corner. And my mother, she's so relieved. This is really going to help her." I poured the coffee slowly, letting her finish. Every word she said carried one clear message. This was already happening. When she finally paused, I placed the cup in front of her and sat down. "Laura," I said gently, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," she replied. "Did you or Adrian ever ask me if I wanted this?" Her smile didn't disappear completely, but it shifted, just enough. "Adrian said you were okay with it," she answered. "He said you thought it would be good to have us here." I looked at her calmly. "That's not true." The room changed instantly. "I'm not lonely," I continued. "I'm independent. And no one asked me what I wanted." For the first time since she arrived, she didn't have an answer ready, and in that moment something small but important shifted, because the assumption had been challenged. But what they didn't realize yet was that this was only the beginning. Laura didn't say anything for a few seconds after I spoke. She just sat there holding her cup, her fingers resting along the edge like she needed something steady to hold onto. The confidence she had walked in with didn't disappear completely, but it shifted. It softened into something more cautious, more uncertain. "I think maybe there was a misunderstanding," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "Adrian made it sound like this was already something you agreed on." I gave a small nod, not out of agreement but acknowledgement. "That's exactly the problem," I said quietly. "It was never a conversation. It was a decision, just not mine." The room felt different now, not tense exactly, but no longer comfortable. There was a weight in the air, something unspoken but understood. Laura glanced around the kitchen as if seeing it properly for the first time, not as a future space she could redesign or fill, but as someone else's home. A place that already had a rhythm, a history, a life of its own. "I didn't realize," she said, her voice lower now. "Adrian said you've been alone since your husband passed. He thought this would help." I let out a slow breath. "Living alone doesn't mean I need help," I replied. "It means I finally have control over my own life." She didn't argue with that. Instead, she nodded slightly as if something had begun to make sense, but not completely, because she wasn't the one making the decisions. Adrian was. And I knew this conversation with her was only the beginning of a much larger one. Later that afternoon, just as I expected, Adrian arrived. This time he didn't walk in casually. He knocked twice, firm and deliberate. I opened the door, and for a moment neither of us spoke. There was something in his expression that told me Laura had already spoken to him. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in the living room, the same place where he had played as a child, where birthdays had been celebrated, where quiet evenings had passed without tension or expectation. But now the room felt different. Not because it had changed, but because we had. Laura said you're not comfortable with us moving in, he began, getting straight to the point. I didn't say I was uncomfortable, I replied calmly. I said no one asked me. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose like he was trying to stay patient. Mom, we're family, he said. We don't need to make everything so formal. We're just trying to make things work. That's exactly what concerns me, I said. You're trying to make things work for you without considering how it affects me. He frowned, clearly not expecting that answer. It's not like we're strangers, he said. This is our family home too. I looked at him carefully before responding. No, I said quietly, it's not. The words landed harder than I intended, but they were true. This house belongs to me, I continued. I worked for it, I paid for it, I maintained it, and I've built a life here that I'm not willing to give up just because it's convenient for someone else. His expression shifted, frustration creeping in. So what are we supposed to do? He asked, his tone tightening. You want us to just struggle while you sit here alone in a house that's too big for you? There it was, not concern, not care, resentment. I stayed calm. I want you to figure things out the same way I did, I said, with effort, with patience, without assuming someone else will fix it for you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy but necessary. Then he shook his head slightly, standing up. I don't think you understand how difficult things are right now, he said, and I don't think you understand what you're asking me to give up, I replied. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused for just a second like he might say something else. But then he didn't, and just like that, he was gone. That evening, the house felt quiet again. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This one carried something underneath it, something unresolved, something waiting. Over the next 2 days, I heard nothing from Adrian, no calls, no messages. But I knew that silence wasn't acceptance, it was preparation, and right on time it came. Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of a car door closing outside, then another, then voices. I didn't rush to the window, I didn't need to. I already knew what I would see. When I finally looked, there it was, a moving truck, boxes, Adrian standing near the driveway talking to 2 men who were already beginning to unload furniture. Laura stood nearby, her expression more hesitant than before, while the children moved around excitedly, unaware of the tension building in the air. For a moment, I just stood there, not shocked, not angry, just ready. I walked to the front door and opened it before they could knock. Adrian looked up, surprised to see me already standing there. Mom, he said, as if everything was normal. We didn't want to waste time. It's better to just get settled quickly. I stepped forward slightly, my voice calm but firm. You're not moving in. The words stopped everything. The movers paused, Laura froze, even the children went quiet. Adrian frowned, confusion turning quickly into frustration. We already talked about this, he said. You're overreacting. No, I replied. I made my position clear. You just chose to ignore it. He glanced at the movers, then back at me, lowering his voice slightly. Mom, don't do this in front of everyone. I held his gaze. You're the one who brought everyone here without permission, I said. The tension in the air thickened. For a moment, it felt like things might escalate, but then something unexpected happened. Laura stepped forward. Adrian, wait, she said quietly. He turned toward her, clearly irritated. What? She hesitated, then looked at me before speaking again. She's right, she said softly. We should have waited. That shifted everything, not completely but enough. Adrian's frustration turned toward her now. So what, we just leave? He asked. After everything we've already planned? Laura didn't answer immediately. Because deep down, she already knew this wasn't their decision to make. And for the first time since all of this started, that truth was no longer being ignored. I stepped back slightly, keeping my voice steady. You need to take your things, I said, and find another solution. Adrian looked at me one last time, his expression filled with something between disbelief and anger. You're really doing this? He asked. I didn't hesitate. Yes, because this wasn't about being difficult, it was about being clear, it was about drawing a line that should have been there from the beginning, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel uncertain. I felt certain. The movers slowly began placing boxes back into the truck. The sound of shifting furniture filled the air, replacing what could have been an argument. Laura gently guided the children back toward the car, her movements quiet, controlled. Adrian stood still for a moment longer, like he was deciding whether to say something else. But in the end, he didn't. He just turned, walked away, and got into the car. As the truck pulled away, the driveway slowly emptied, leaving behind only silence. But this time, it wasn't heavy, it wasn't uncertain, it was clear, because sometimes the hardest thing isn't saying no. It's standing by it when everything around you tries to push you in the other direction. And as I stood there, watching the last of them disappear down the road, I realized something important. This wasn't the end of the situation. Not yet. Because people don't let go of control that easily, especially when they believe it was theirs to begin with, and something told me Adrian wasn't finished trying. For the rest of that day, the house felt unusually still. Not empty, just still, like everything had settled into place after something that had been building for a long time. I closed the front door slowly and stood there for a moment, my hand resting against the wood, listening to the silence that followed after the truck disappeared down the street. Most people would think I felt relief, and I did, but not in the way they might expect. It wasn't relief from conflict, it was relief from pressure. The kind of pressure that creeps in quietly, disguising itself as responsibility, as family obligation, as something you're supposed to accept without question. And once it settles in, it becomes harder to push back against, because saying no starts to feel like you're doing something wrong. But I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply protected what was mine. That evening, I moved through the house slowly, almost deliberately, as if reminding myself of every detail. The living room where I had spent quiet evenings. The kitchen where routines had formed over years. The small hallway where the floor creaked in the same spot every time. These weren't just parts of a house, they were pieces of a life I had built carefully, patiently, without shortcuts. And I wasn't going to let that be taken from me. The next morning, I called Lucia again. She arrived just as she had before, on time, calm, observant. She didn't ask what happened right away. She didn't need to. She could see it in the way I stood, in the way the house felt. "It's done," I said simply. She nodded. "And?" she asked. "They tried anyway," I replied. "Showed up with a truck, boxes, like my answer didn't matter." Lucia didn't look surprised. "They were hoping you'd give in under pressure," she said. "I know," I replied. There was a brief silence before I added, "But I didn't." She smiled slightly, not in celebration, but in recognition. "Good," she said. We sat at the kitchen table again, just like before. But this time, the conversation felt different. Lighter, clearer, because now there was no uncertainty left. The line had been drawn, and it had held. But what Adrian didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't just said no. I had prepared for everything that could come after it, because saying no is one thing, protecting that decision is something else entirely. A week passed, then another. Adrian didn't call, Laura didn't visit. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt intentional, like distance that needed to exist. But then, on the 15th day, my phone rang. "Adrian." I looked at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hello?" There was a short pause before he spoke. "Mom, can we talk?" His tone was different, not confident, not frustrated, quieter. "About what?" I asked calmly. "About everything," he said. I hesitated for just a second, then replied, "You can come by tomorrow." He agreed. The next afternoon, he arrived alone. No moving truck, no assumptions, just him. When I opened the door, he looked different somehow. Not physically, but in the way he carried himself. Less certain, more aware. We sat in the living room for a few moments. Neither of us spoke. Then he finally broke the silence. "I shouldn't have done that," he said. I didn't respond immediately. "I thought," he continued, then stopped, searching for the right words. "I thought it made sense, that it would be easier for everyone." "For you," I said quietly. He nodded. "Yes." For me, there was honesty in that, not complete understanding, but a start. "I didn't think about what it meant for you," he added. I looked at him carefully. "No," I said, "you didn't." The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was reflective. "I was wrong," he said after a moment. That was the first time he had said it. Clearly, directly, and I could hear the difference, because this time it wasn't said to convince me, it was said because he meant it. But even then, I knew something important. An apology doesn't undo a pattern, it only acknowledges it. "What happens now?" he asked. That was the question that mattered, because this wasn't about one moment. It was about everything moving forward. "You move forward," I said calmly. "You find your own place, you build your own stability. And us?" he asked. I held his gaze. We take time, I said, because trust isn't automatic. It has to be rebuilt. He nodded slowly, not arguing, not pushing, just accepting. And that was something I hadn't seen from him in a long time. After he left, I sat in the same chair for a while thinking. Not about what had happened, but about what almost happened. Because if I had said yes that day, if I had stayed quiet, if I had allowed things to move forward just to avoid conflict, everything would be different right now. This house wouldn't feel like mine, my routines would be gone, my independence slowly replaced by compromise after compromise. And the hardest part, it wouldn't have happened all at once, it would have happened slowly. So slowly that one day I would have looked around and realized I had nothing left that truly belonged to me. That's how these things happen, not with force, with assumption, with pressure, with silence, but I didn't stay silent. And that made all the difference. A few days later, Laura called. Her tone was softer than before. I just wanted to say, I understand now, she said, and I'm sorry for how everything was handled. I thanked her. Because unlike Adrian, she hadn't pushed, she had followed, and now she understood. Over time, things began to settle, not back to the way they were, but into something new, something more honest. Adrian and I spoke occasionally. Short conversations, careful but respectful, the kind that rebuilds slowly instead of pretending nothing happened, and that was enough, because sometimes distance isn't a problem, it's a correction. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the street. The same street I had lived on for years, the same house, the same quiet, but something had changed, not outside, inside. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I needed to defend my space. I had already done that, and I had proven something to myself in the process. That independence doesn't disappear with age. It only disappears when you give it away, and I wasn't willing to do that. Not for comfort, not for pressure, not even for family, because family isn't about taking what someone has built, it's about respecting it. And sometimes the strongest thing you can say isn't yes, it's no, even when it's difficult, even when it creates distance, even when it changes everything. Because in the end, the life you protect is the life you get to keep. And if I had given in that day, I wouldn't be sitting here now in a home that still feels like mine.